The wind in North Dakota didn't just blow, it hunted. It was a jagged, invisible blade that sliced through denim and skin, seeking the heat of anything still foolish enough to be alive. Inside the suffocating warmth of her mother-in-law's mahogany-furnished living room, Sarah felt a different kind of cold. The kind that starts in the marrow when you realize the people who called you family have turned into strangers. "Check her coat, Jackson," his mother hissed, her voice as sharp as the ice outside. "She's the only one who knew where the emergency cash was kept. $500 doesn't just walk out of a kitchen drawer." Sarah stood frozen, her fingers digging into the shoulders of 4-year-old Emily. "I didn't touch it," she whispered, her voice trembling not from guilt, but from the sheer weight of the betrayal. She looked at Jackson, her husband's younger brother, hoping for a shred of the loyalty their late father had once promised. But Jackson looked away. In the eyes of this proud, judgmental Midwestern clan, Sarah, the girl from the wrong side of the tracks, who had married their golden boy, was the only logical thief. "Out!" the mother-in-law commanded, tossing a threadbare duffel bag toward the door. "Take your lies and your needs and get off this land. We won't have a thief under this roof." By the time the heavy oak door slammed shut, the sun was dipping below the horizon, turning the sky a bruised purple. Sarah stood on the porch, Emily's small hand clutching hers. They had no car, no phone, and exactly $42 in Sarah's pocket, the meager tips she'd hidden away from her shifts at the local diner. She knew the town's pity would be worse than their scorn. The shelters in the city were 3 towns over, and the local motel would burn through her $40 in a single night. She needed a miracle, or she needed to be brave. She remembered an old, rusted-out hunter's shack on the edge of the Thorne property, a claim that had been abandoned for a decade after the owner died in a blizzard. It was a place locals joked was cursed, a square of land so desolate that even the crows avoided it. "Is Daddy coming to get us?" Emily asked, her breath puffing out in white clouds. Sarah knelt, zipping Emily's pink parka up to her chin. "No, baby, we're going on an adventure. We're going to build our own castle." With the last of her strength, Sarah hauled the duffel bag and her daughter toward the edge of town. She used 35 of her $40 to bribe a local scrap hauler to drop them at the shack's coordinates. As the truck's taillights faded into the swirling snow, Sarah looked at the castle. It was a leaning box of corrugated tin and rotting timber, shivering in the gale. It looked like a tomb, but as she felt Emily's teeth begin to chatter, Sarah's fear hardened into a cold, diamond-sharp resolve. This wasn't just a shack. It was the only thing in the world that no one could take from her. It was the start of their war against the world. The rusted padlock on the shack's door didn't require a key. It surrendered with a single desperate yank, the metal screaming in protest against the ice. As the door groaned open, a wave of stale, frozen air, the smell of wet wool and decades-old abandonment, washed over Sarah. She fumbled for her flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness to reveal a space no larger than a backyard shed. It was a nightmare of corrugated tin and rotting pine. Snow had drifted through the gaps in the roof, forming miniature white dunes on the floorboards. In the corner sat a pot-bellied stove, so orange with rust it looked like it might crumble if Sarah breathed on it too hard. Emily stood by the door, her thumb hovering near her mouth, a habit she had outgrown a year ago, but reclaimed the moment they stepped into the cold. "Is this the castle, Mommy?" Emily whispered, her voice tiny and hollow. "It's the foundation, Em," Sarah replied, her voice cracking. She didn't let herself sit down. If she sat, the exhaustion would claim her, and in this temperature, that meant never waking up. "We just have to put the walls on." She spent the first hour frantically gathering what remained of the previous owner's woodpile. Every scrap of cedar and oak was gold. When the stove finally caught, spitting out a meager, smoky heat, Sarah huddled Emily close to the iron belly of the heater. But as she watched the wind whip through the quarter-inch gaps in the siding, she realized the fire was a losing battle. The tin walls were acting like a refrigerator. They weren't just failing to hold the heat, they were actively stealing it. By 3 a.m., the temperature plummeted to 20 below. Sarah watched the frost creep across the interior walls, forming intricate, deadly patterns. She realized then that they wouldn't survive the week, let alone the season, in a tin box. She remembered her father talking about the old sod houses, the soddies that the first pioneers built when they had nothing but the earth in their own two hands. "The earth doesn't freeze all the way through, Sarah," he used to say. "It's the best blanket God ever made." The next morning, under a sun that gave light but no warmth, Sarah found an old, rusted spade in the lean-to. She walked a few yards from the shack and struck the ground. The blade bounced off the permafrost with a jarring clink that vibrated up her arms, stinging her shoulders. She struck again and again. She wasn't a farmer. She was a girl who had spent her life clearing tables and folding laundry. But as she looked back at the shack, seeing Emily's small, pale face pressed against the grime-streaked window, Sarah felt a surge of adrenaline that tasted like copper. She began to cut. She used the spade to score the frozen turf into rectangular slabs, each one heavy as a cinder block. She dragged the first slab of frozen earth to the base of the shack and leaned it against the tin. Then the second. Then the third. Her plan was simple and desperate. She would bury the house. She would wrap the rusted metal in a 5-foot-thick layer of North Dakota soil. It was back-breaking, grueling work that turned her fingernails black and tore the skin of her palms until her work gloves were stained dark with blood. Every time she felt her heart flutter with exhaustion, she would look at Emily, who was now helping by picking up smaller chunks of frozen grass to fill the crevices. Sarah wasn't just stacking dirt. She was building a barrier between her daughter and the cruelty of the world that had cast them out. By sunset, she had completed only the first 2 rows around the base. But as she stepped inside, the wind's howl sounded just a little bit muffled. For the first time since the door had slammed at her mother-in-law's house, Sarah felt a flicker of something she hadn't dared to name: defiance. The second week of February arrived with a sky the color of a bruised plum. In the town of Oaks, the locals spoke of Sarah in hushed, judgmental tones over lukewarm coffee at the diner. They called her "that crazy girl on the thorn lot," convinced she was either hiding stolen money or had finally lost her mind to the grief of her husband's death and her family's betrayal. But out on the edge of the world, Sarah didn't have the luxury of going crazy. She was too busy bleeding. Her life had narrowed down to a single, repetitive motion: drive the spade into the frozen earth, pry up the sod, and carry the 30-pound slab to the shack. Her hands, once soft from years of service work, were now a map of calluses and half-healed scabs. She had reinforced her work gloves with duct tape, but the grit still found its way in, grinding against her skin like sandpaper. "Mommy, look! I'm a builder too," Emily chirped, dragging a small chunk of earth to fill a gap near the doorstep. The girl was bundled in so many layers she moved like a little penguin, her cheeks a constant wind-burned scarlet. Sarah forced a smile, though her back felt like it was being fused together by hot wire. "You're the best foreman I've ever had, Em," Sarah panted, wiping sweat from her brow that froze almost instantly into salt crystals. By mid-month, the shack had been transformed. It no longer looked like a tin shed. It looked like a hill that had decided to grow a door. The sod walls were now 4 feet thick at the base, tapering slightly as they reached the roofline. Sarah had hauled discarded timber from a nearby construction site to create a frame that supported the heavy earth against the fragile metal siding. Inside, the change was miraculous. The roaring wind, which used to make the tin plates rattle like machine gun fire, was reduced to a distant, muffled hum. The pot-bellied stove didn't have to work as hard anymore. The earth was holding the heat, cradling them in a dark, silent warmth that felt like an apology from the land itself. But the physical toll was reaching a breaking point. One evening, after stacking the final row of sod around the chimney pipe, Sarah's legs simply gave out. She collapsed into the snow, her lungs burning with the intake of sub-zero air. She looked up at the stars, vast, cold, and indifferent. And for a moment, the temptation to just stay down was overwhelming. The stolen $500 didn't matter. The mother-in-law's cruelty didn't matter. Only the silence mattered. Then she heard the wooden door of the shack creak open. Emily peered out, the golden light from the stove spilling out behind her like a halo. "Mommy, the cocoa is ready. I stirred it just like you showed me." Sarah took a ragged breath, pushed her cracked palms into the ice, and forced herself to stand. Her muscles screamed, a chorus of agony that vibrated through her spine, but she straightened her shoulders. She wasn't just a waitress or a cast-off daughter-in-law anymore. She was a mason. She was a protector. As she limped toward the light of the door, she looked back at the fortress she had built with nothing but grit and a mother's desperation. The town thought she was a thief, but out here she was a queen of a dirt empire and she was just getting started. By the first week of March, the Dakota sky didn't just turn gray, it turned a terrifying opaque white. This was the Great Whiteout the old-timers at the diner always warned about. A blizzard so thick you could lose your porch while standing on it. Inside the sod-wrapped shack, the air was eerily still. The 5-foot-thick walls of earth held the silence like a tomb, but a warm one. Sarah sat by the stove, reading a tattered picture book to Emily by the glow of a single kerosene lamp. For the first time in months, she felt a fragile sense of peace. The world was screaming outside, but it couldn't get in. That peace shattered when the smell of acrid chemical smoke began to seep through the ventilation pipe. Sarah stood up, her heart hammering against her ribs. She cracked the door just an inch, and the wind nearly tore it off the hinges. Through the swirling chaos of white, she saw it. A dull, orange pulse in the distance, back toward the main road. It wasn't just a fire. It was a beacon of disaster. The town's community center, the sturdy brick building where the displaced and the respectable families gathered for safety, was being devoured by flames. "Stay here, Emily. Stay under the blankets and do not move. Do you hear me?" Sarah's voice was like iron. She wrapped her face in a wool scarf, tied a rope to the doorframe so she could find her way back, and stepped into the abyss. The cold was a physical blow, a weight that tried to crush her lungs. She fought her way toward the light, crawling on her hands and knees when the wind threatened to hurl her into the darkness. When she reached the perimeter of the burning building, the scene was a nightmare. The roof had collapsed under the weight of the snow and the heat. A group of 20 people, including her mother-in-law and Jackson, were huddled together in the lee of a stone wall, their faces pale with the onset of hypothermia. They were trapped between a fire they couldn't put out and a cold that was guaranteed to kill them before dawn. Sarah didn't hesitate. She didn't ask for an apology, and she didn't bring up the stolen money. She simply stepped into the firelight looking like a ghost risen from the earth. "Follow the rope!" she screamed over the gale, grabbing the arm of a shivering child. "Move or you die. My house is 300 yards south. Follow me." The trek back was a slow-motion funeral procession. Sarah led the way, acting as a human shield against the wind. She saw her mother-in-law stumble, the woman's expensive fur coat now a useless frozen rag. Without a word, Sarah hauled the older woman to her feet and shoved her forward. When the group finally stumbled through the door of the sod shack, they gasped. The interior was cramped, smelling of damp earth and wood smoke, but it was warm. As the 20 residents of Oaks huddled together on the dirt floor, staring in awe at the fortress this thief had built with her bare hands, the silence was deafening. Jackson looked at his sister-in-law, then at the thick, protective walls of sod, his face twisted with a shame deeper than any frostbite. Sarah just turned back to the stove to put on a pot of water. She had saved the people who had destroyed her life, not because they deserved it, but because she was no longer the woman they had kicked out. She was the one who held the keys to their survival. The dawn that followed the Great Whiteout was unlike any Sarah had ever seen. The sky was a pale, crystalline blue, and the wind had finally dropped to a rhythmic whisper. Inside the shack, the air was thick with the scent of damp wool and the heavy, humbling silence of 20 people who had just realized they owed their lives to a woman they had cast out. Jackson was the first to speak. He stood near the sod-packed wall, his fingers tracing the rough, frozen grass that had kept them from freezing. "Sarah," he began, his voice cracking like thin ice. He pulled a crumpled envelope from his inner jacket pocket, the same $500 that had sparked the fire of betrayal. I found it. It wasn't stolen. It was tucked behind the drawer liner in the kitchen. My mother, she just wanted a reason to let you go. A heavy hush fell over the room. Sarah didn't reach for the money. She didn't scream, and she didn't cry. She simply kept stirring the oats for Emily's breakfast. The truth felt small compared to the physical weight of the fortress she had built. The money was just paper. The walls around them were a testament to her soul. Her mother-in-law stepped forward, her face haggard and stripped of its usual haughty armor. "We'll rebuild the main house, Sarah," she murmured, eyes downcast. "There's a room for you and Emily. You don't have to live like this anymore." Sarah looked around her castle. The dirt floor, the rusted stove, the smell of the earth that had shielded her child. Then she looked at the people who only saw value in her when she was their last resort. "I'm not going back," Sarah said, her voice quiet but ringing with a newfound authority. "You see a pile of dirt and a rusted shed. I see the only place where I was ever truly safe. This land is mine now. I bought it with my own hands and my own blood. Emily and I are staying." As the townspeople eventually filed out, heading back to the ruins of their lives with bowed heads, they left behind more than just apologies. They left a profound respect that would be told in North Dakota coffee shops for generations. Sarah stood in the doorway watching them go. The winter wasn't over, but its back was broken. In the spring, she would plant wildflowers on the very walls that had saved her. She would dig a well and build a porch where Emily could play in the sun. She had turned scorn into shelter, and in the crucible of the great whiteout, she had forged a version of herself that no one could ever diminish again. The plains would remember her, not as a victim, but as the woman who built a kingdom out of the dust. What would you have done if you were in Sarah's shoes? Would you have forgiven the family that betrayed you? Or would you have let the fire of the past burn those bridges forever? Let us know in the comments below. If this story of resilience and a mother's unbreakable spirit moved you, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. We bring you powerful human stories from the heart of America every week. Don't forget to ring the bell so you never miss a moment of inspiration. Thank you for watching.